climate to falling sea levels. This is a very rhythmic cycle. It's not necessarily regular. There are a lot of things that affect this that have to do with astronomy. The orbit of the Earth, the tilt of the axis wobbles a bit, and the sun itself has cycles. And you don't need to know all that. I certainly don't need to know all that. The point is, when people say, well, climate change, that's just part of the natural cycle, they're partly right. They may even be mostly right. But the critical element is that we should be transitioning into a cooler climate. This is CO2 in the atmosphere, graphed back about 400,000 years. It doesn't go all the way back the full 2.5 million years of the Quaternary period that we're in now, but it has been basically that same pattern. For 650,000 years at least, atmospheric CO2 has never gone above 300 parts per million until now. So we should be going back down into a cooler climate. Instead, we have shot up to a very dangerous and unprecedented place. This is a close-up of the last few years of sea level. Meltwater pulses, or the MWP stands for meltwater pulse. I put this up to show a couple of points. One is that sea level changes rapidly sometimes. During these meltwater pulses, the seas came up an inch or two a year. We know that the ocean can come up that fast because we've seen it come up that fast before. The second thing is, all this meltwater pulses and all this sea level rise happened at a time when the carbon in the atmosphere was actually around below 280 parts per million, going from 180 to 280. These jumps in the meltwater, called meltwater pulses, happened when there was a little tiny increase in CO2. A 10 to 15 part per million increase gave you those jumps in the rate of sea level rise. Nothing at all like the 100 plus parts per million that we have now. Did I skip one? I've lost one. Let me go back one. Humanity first appeared on this planet as Neanderthal about 200,000 years ago. Cro-Magnon showed up about 40,000 years ago. The point is, human beings have never lived on a planet where the CO2 was above 300 parts per million until my lifetime. And I'm not going to take credit for that, but I'm just saying, to put it in perspective, since I came onto this planet, we've gone from below 300 to above 400. It's not okay, it's not natural. I don't know how anybody can look at a graph that tracks CO2 and temperature and not understand the relationship between the two. It's extraordinarily clear to me. This is just a continuation of that thing that Al Gore did where he got on the forklift and he went up. You remember that? Inconvenient truth. And it's astonishing, but clearly our planet is setting records for record hottest year. It's become routine. It doesn't even hardly make the news anymore. When the observatory in Hawaii at Mauna Loa was set up back in 1958, the CO2 in the atmosphere was 280 parts per million. Since 2016, we have stayed above 400. We haven't gone below 400 since September of last year, and in April of this year, we went above 410. The good news is this: carbon dioxide emissions have leveled off, okay? We really need to put the brakes on, but at least we're coasting now, which is great. The bad news is that even if we drop CO2 to emissions, even if we drop those bars all the way down to zero right now immediately, which of course is impossible, we would still see continued global warming for another 30 years or so. Atmospheric CO2 has a half-life of about 50 years. It's not as potent a greenhouse gas as methane is, but methane only lasts about 8 in its half-life. It degrades so much faster. It is the CO2 that's going to continue to give us global warming long past we come to our senses and stop adding it to the atmosphere. You know, there are no glaciers in Glacier National Park. You know, that ought to say something to people. And of course, I'm sure most of the people in this room are aware of the fact that Larsen C finally broke off Antarctica a few days ago. One of the most amazing comments I read about Larsen C was that it really is no big deal. This scientist said to, I forget where I read it, that when Larsen B broke off, it was several years before the ice behind it, before the rest of the shelf in that area finally disintegrated. I'm like going, oh, well then, wake me in several years and I'll get worried about Larsen C. When you look at the map of Antarctica, you can see that the ice that is behind Larsen C is much more than was behind Larsen B. I think Larsen B was the biggest iceberg ever created. I think Larsen C is probably the second largest. Fun fact about Larsen C. It's the size of Delaware. It's 1 trillion tons. And if you spread it evenly over the entire 50 states of the Union, it would make a layer of ice about 4.5 inches thick. That's a lot of ice. And yet, you know, on a global scale, that in and of itself isn't such a big deal. But it's the cork in the bottle. And when you look at the landside photos of that section of Antarctica, you see all this glaciation that's behind it, that is on a slope now, ready to slide down into the ocean. And this decomposition, this breaking down of the ice around Antarctica is continuing unabated. There we go. So I think it's been about a couple of years now. I was coming in late from a sailing trip, and I apologize for others who have heard this story before, but it's a pretty good story. We were late getting in, my engine wasn't working, and we've been out doing a club race. The channel into the club where I keep the boat wasn't deep enough that you could come and go anytime you wanted to. You had to catch the tide a certain way. And I knew that because we were late coming in, I wasn't going to be able to get in without help. So I've called ahead to the club. I said, don't put they have a motorboat that they use for the race. I said, don't put the club boat away. You're probably going to have to drag me in because I think I'm going to get stuck in the channel. But I didn't get stuck. I didn't even bump. And I thought, well, that's very odd. That is very, very odd. I wonder how that happened. So when I got home, I went to this website, which I check frequently. Whenever there's a storm in the bay or some reason why I might need to go down and attend to the boat to slack the lines or whatever, I can check this website and see exactly in real time where the water is. And they also give you a graph and you can track it back. And the water that day was 7 inches deeper than predicted, 7 inches deeper than it should have been. And I thought, why would that be? There are a lot of reasons why the water in the bay would be 7 inches or even more deeper. A south wind pushes the water up in the bay, low pressure system storms, but none of those things were in play. So I started looking back. And I discovered that, oh, the water's been 7 inches deeper in the bay quite a lot. Quite a lot. And about 2.5 weeks later, I got back to my life because I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop. I was absolutely obsessed because I started looking backwards into all this. And the difference between the predicted sea level and the observed sea level was so great and so consistent. You can go here, you can download a month at a time the hourly predicted tide, export that to an Excel spreadsheet. You can download the verified observed level, export that. You simply subtract column A from column B, and that gives you the difference between the predicted tide and the verified tide that was observed. That 24 data points per day, however many days there are in a year, average that number. That gives you the average difference for that month between the observed and the predicted tide. I tend to think of that as sea level rise when it's a positive value. But it was simple math. And it gave me these graphs. This is why I couldn't stop. Because what I was seeing there was so disturbing. You know, it didn't bother me too much that for the 20 years starting in 1990 we saw a 1/10 of an inch per year. That's cool. That's not a problem. But when I looked at the last 7 years, at that time I was looking at 5. The average now is right almost 5/8 of an inch. Depends on how you round it. But it is more than a 1/2 inch per year average difference year over year. We've seen more than 3.5 inches, almost 4 inches sea level rise just since 2010 began. This is so at variance with what I see from the government, what you read in the standard predictions. It left me feeling a little bit like William Shatner in that old Twilight Zone, I believe it was, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. So those who are as old as me might remember he looks out the window of the airplane and he sees this monster out on the wing ripping the engine apart and shoving pieces into the engine. And nobody could see it but him, you see. Nobody could see it but him. And I shared this with anybody I could. I said, you got to check my numbers here. This can't possibly be correct. Fortunately for my sanity, I discovered Brian McNulty down at the University of Miami. And coincidentally, he had done a more scientific, a more analytic, but basically the same thing with the tide levels at Virginia Key down there in Miami. Of course, we all know that Miami has got deep concerns with, it gets deeper every year, sea level rise. And he came up with values that were even higher than mine because he did some things. He did average seasonal cycle and series mean removed, okay? I don't even know what that means. All right, I'm perfectly honest. What I did was simple math. It was just A minus B equals C. He did a real scientific analysis. And you might not be able to see, but when he looks at 20 years, he has 22 1/100ths of a year, average over 20 years. He has 35 1/100ths of an inch over 15 years, a little less than a 1/2 inch, 0.48 over the last 10, almost an inch, 0.92 over the last 5 years. Now, this graph, just like the one I came up with, see, that's what you call noisy data. It's up and down, it's jumping all over the place. It makes it really hard to understand what you're seeing. The lines are from Excel trend lines. You know, Excel just does that automatically. It gives you the the area under the curve and plot and gives you an appropriate. It's at any rate. The point being, he went beyond that and did some further analysis where he took 5-year average trends and averaged them out. So in other words, he took the average 7 through 11, 0.22, 0.21, 0.47, so forth. Now, it's not a straight line. You know, it's not something that progresses on a regular, predictable interval, but the trend is pretty astonishing. Basically, what we see is that it's completely consistent with what I see in Tampa Bay. The first 2 inches of sea level rise in Tampa Bay took 40 years. The second 2 inches of sea level rise took 20 years, half as long. And then we saw 4 inches of sea level rise in just 7 years. The time is being halved between the doubling rates. It's I think you call that a geometric progression. It's not okay. It's definitely not okay. And it's happened since about 2010. This is a relatively recent phenomenon. It is very noisy data, and I'll give people some credit for not, scientists, some credit for not picking up on it quite as quickly as they might. And we'll talk more about why science is where it is on this and what's going on there. So we know where we are now. Let's look at what we can expect. And especially, I want to look at the sea level rise vulnerability assessment for the city of Tampa. And I want to look at that because it is very typical of the kind of reports that our government has been putting out. And this is the stuff, this makes me crazy. This is a chart from the sea level assessment. They're predicting 0.47. This is in the high column. 0.47 sea level rise by the year 2015. Or 0.47 by the year this year, high 2020. Okay, we're already at over a half foot. We're already more than 6 inches relative to 1990. Most of the values on this chart, anything that's less than a half, anything that's less than 0.5, we're already there. It already happened. What is this doing in a report that's supposed to help us prepare for the future?
Ken?
Yes.
When was the report published?
The city of Tampa received that report earlier this year. And I want to say this. It is not because my friend Sean College, who prepared this report, is a bad person or he's in league with some sort of vast right-wing conspiracy. This has to do with the nature of science. Okay? And the reality is, and Margaret Davison said this in San Diego last year. She addressed the Risk Insurance Management Society. That is the insurance industry. These are some good time guys. And she plainly told them that reports like this come out about every 5 years. They're going on old data, and she said, and this is a quote, by the time the scientists compiling those reports get the data out, it's roughly 2 years old because it took those gathering the data that long to collect it. It takes the authors of the reports a few years to compile them, and by the time we get out a report, she is was the senior we'll get to her in a minute. Senior NOAA advisor for coastal adaptation. I forget her exact title, but she was a person who would know. By the time we get out the report, it's actually synthesizing data from a decade ago. Now, when we're dealing with something that's just been going on for the last 5 or 6 years, data that's a decade old isn't going to get it done. This is the very typical chart from the NOAA high, NOAA low. We're already here, okay? You can forget about all those other lines. The only line you need to look at is the top line. The rest of that stuff, we've already passed all of that. As a matter of fact, oops, okay. You back up here. You get back on track. Those of you who have been to the Sierra Club and watched some of my presenters deal with this thing, I'm gaining a whole new appreciation for this. And what it is when you have a really big image and there's a little latency in the computer while it takes it to load, so you wind up clicking too many times. This is the NOAA chart that came out in 2012. This is where we are here. Once again, we are on the top line. Dr. Harold Wanlitz put out a paper in April of this year, and he said, and I quote, "The highest model projection is 6.6 feet rise by the end of this century, projected by the U.S. government, must now be seen as the low-medium projection." It was very gratifying to read that from the chair of the geology department at the University of Miami. You know, I'm beginning to think there are other people who can see that guy on the wing besides just me. This came out in January of this year, 5 years after the last one. They added an extreme line there in red that takes us up to 2.5 meters, about 8.4 feet. But they assigned it a 0.1% probability. You know, I get it. Every 5 years they're going to move their lines up a foot or two, and by the time we get to 2100, they'll be right. They'll be right, you know. Let's look at some other projections. In 2015, Dr. James Hansen, he had a team of, I forget, it was 14, 16, 18 of the world's most renowned climatologists, raised scientific hackles because he published a report without submitting it to peer review first. He did it because the information in that report was so time sensitive. It was so important to get this information out there that to go through the normal peer review process and add another year or two to getting the report out would have been irresponsible. James Hansen, for those who don't know, is accustomed to raising hackles. It's one of the things he does best, and he does it proudly. He testified before Congress back in the 80s about climate change and was ridiculed for predicting that we would now be exactly where we are. Okay? He was dead on then. So when he says 6 to 15 feet of sea level rise by 2100, you need to pay attention to him. He quit his job for the government because he said you can't sue the government if you work for the government. Google James Hansen. He's got some great YouTube videos out. He is a pleasure to listen to, and he's absolutely sincere in what he's saying. He knows what he's talking about. This is Dr. Margaret Davidson again. She told the people in San Diego in April of last year 6 to 9 feet by 2050 to 2060. That's nothing at all like what you saw in this sea level threat assessment or what you see in the NOAA projections. This is radically different. Senior Advisor for Coastal Inundation and Resilience. She died recently, just a few months ago, of a long illness, a long terminal illness. And I wonder, when she told, this caused quite a stir when she said this. And I wondered if being aware that she was nearing the end of her life, it gave her the courage to step out and break ranks with our other government scientists and say what she knew in her heart to be true. Maybe someday we'll hear about that. Dr. Eric Rigneau, I hope I'm saying that right. He is a NASA scientist. He's an iceman. He does satellites and all that kind of stuff. It's been his life's work to measure ice. You can also get him on YouTube. He does an hour-long presentation. You can also get just the end of it. He says 20 to 30 feet over the next 100 to 200 years. He's quite sardonic in his presentation. I highly recommend him. He approaches this with a sense of humor that is really inspiring. You know, and I won't even attempt to replicate his humor, but 20 to 30 feet over the next 100 to 200 years. And he'll tell you plainly, he says, we don't know. We've never done this before. We've never seen this before. It's never happened before. You know, human beings have never been on a planet where the CO2 was above 300 parts per million. All right? But it should be getting colder. The water should be going down. And it's not. It's getting hotter, and the water is coming up. And then just this April, Dr. Wallace, that I mentioned a moment ago, said that we should be preparing for 10 to 30 feet by the end of this century. Now that's quite a range of predictions, but you know, you can kind of see a pattern emerging there. There's two things. First off, the later the predictions are, the more dire the forecast is. If you ask Dr. Hansen today, I think he will probably give you an answer that is more than 6 to 15 feet. The other thing is that as time goes by, one by one by one, more and more government scientists are stepping away from the ranks. More and more are stepping forward to say what they know to be true, which is that, folks, we're in deep trouble. Okay? It is not as bad as you thought. It's a whole lot worse, as the saying goes. Tampa, 2040. Do I know that this is true? I don't know this is true. I know that if I looked at the rate of increase that I've seen over the last few years and continue that, extrapolate that rate forward and stop it at 1.5 inches, which is just arbitrary. I pick 1.5 inches because we know that sea level has risen from 1 to 2 inches during those meltwater pulses, so you know, I don't think it can keep accelerating forever. So let's assume that when it gets to 1.5 inches per year, it'll level off. If you make those assumptions, by the year 2040, you have 3 feet of sea level rise in Tampa Bay. Sunset Park, some of you know where that is. The streets begin to flood. Simmons Park, Bahia Beach, Shell Point become islands at that point. Port Tampa, south of Gandy. It's one of those areas where at-risk populations live. They start to have serious flooding, and other areas west of MacDill also start to flood. Using the same projections, the same methodology, And again, it could be 2048, it could be 2040, it could be 2058, but let's make our best guess, okay? Let's get our head out of the sand and stop pretending that what we know to be true isn't true. Flooding continues to spread. The north and east end of Davis Island floods. Several neighborhoods west of West Shore begin to flood. Highway 41 between Gibson and Apollo Beach is gone. And large portions of Ruskin, as well as other portions of Bayshore, are flooding. 2056, things are getting pretty serious here. Pretty much you've lost everything west of West Shore. Access to Port Tampa is gone. Apollo Beach starts to flood, the streets there. Big Bend is accessible only by water. And one more foot and you can hardly recognize Tampa anymore. Now, if this is what we think might be happening, why would we not want to admit this? You know, what's the advantage to minimizing the risk instead of addressing it head on? Well, there are several. For one thing, once we get to 6 feet of sea level rise, 1 in 8, 12.5% of Florida's homes are going to be lost. $413 billion of damage. This now we're getting into cost-benefit analysis. One of the recurring themes of climate deniers is, well, yes, maybe the climate is changing, and maybe some of it is due to carbon pollution, and maybe we can mitigate that. But the cost of doing that is far outweighed by what we would save by going to renewable energy, you know, which is going to be just horribly expensive, and it's going to be economically disruptive. It's just going to be a nightmare if we don't continue to burn fossil fuels. This is the nightmare scenario, okay? And here's the kicker. I mean, you can go to FannieMae.com or Google this, FannieMae.com, Life's a Beach, B-E-A-C-H. And you will read a very long article on the Fannie Mae website discussing, or actually not so much discussing, but conjecturing about what it might look like, what the different ways it might happen that waterfront properties start to collapse in value. And you know, again, we've never done this before, so who knows? But they speculate. Fannie Mae on their website speculates. Will it be because a bank refused to lend money on a house because of the threat of sea level rise, or because there was inundation in the neighborhood? Will that cause all the other property values to fall? Or will it be because an insurance company refuses to renew a policy? Or will it be because some homeowners start to sell defensively? You know, they see what's coming and they start to dump their property. As a matter of fact, you know, up in New Jersey and down in Miami, both, there are people who are trapped in their houses, especially up in New Jersey, because there were people who worked at Trump Tower there. They've lost their jobs. Everything they own is in their house, and they can't sell their house because of the recurring floods. And they're trapped. What do you think the odds are that the government is going to go into these low-income houses, areas, neighborhoods, and bail these people out? You know, protecting waterfront assets is going to be a very expensive proposition. Local governments are going to have a lot of demands on their limited assets. Where are they going to put those assets? You can pretty well figure that out. The other thing, and you know, an article was forwarded to me by our director the other day, the Sierra Club director, that included a whole bunch of quotes from people, most of them developers. Okay? Now, these guys are smart and they're pretty well informed, but they're not about to admit that sea level rise is going to have an impact on development and real estate in Florida, because that's where they're making their money. Any more than a politician who sees his legacy, the redevelopment of a downtown district, is going to acknowledge that Tampa is seriously threatened by rising water. And I don't think I've said it yet tonight. I try to say this at least once every day. Of the 10 cities in the world most threatened by sea level rise, 5 are in the United States, 2 are in Florida, and ladies and gentlemen, we are in one of them. In the entire world. Okay? So, why all the confusion? My first father-in-law was a professor of agriculture at the University of Kentucky. Dating his daughter, I was a freshman. And I would debate Dr. Rudnick, who is this tall, gaunt, scary dude. Okay, he had one eye that he lost in the war that always stared out straight forward. And he had this Prussian accent and always smoking the pipe. And I would go round and round with him about the link between tobacco and cancer. Okay, I didn't make a lot of headway. You know, I was seriously outgunned. A 17-year-old college freshman up against a PhD professor at agriculture. But the thing is, you see, in Kentucky at that time, tobacco was our largest cash crop. A professor in the Department of Agriculture could no more admit that tobacco had anything to do with cancer, you know, than the Koch brothers could. At any rate, you get the picture. Well, it turns out that Bast, Joe Bast, from the Heartland Institute, who is one of the really strong climate deniers, he's out there, you know, showing us all these reasons why climate denial isn't real, and if it is real, there's nothing we can do about it anyway, and if we could do anything about it, it wouldn't be practical. You know that he worked for R.J. Reynolds?
Wow.
Telling people that you can smoke 7 cigarettes a day and it might actually be good for you. So, you know, here I am, 50 years down the road, and I'm hitting the same wall. You know, life is too strange sometimes. Open Secrets says that the fossil fuel industry gave politicians last cycle, it was almost $100 million. In exchange for that, they get about $119 in benefits for every dollar that they contribute. Perhaps as much as $52 billion in direct subsidies. Direct subsidies, tax breaks. This is not counting all the other things we do for them, protecting lines of supply and so forth and so on. Gas and oil exploration are the only industries exempt from Nixon's Clean Water Act. They got that exemption through the Halliburton loophole created by the Cheney Energy Bill. You know, this from a group that likes to talk about free enterprise, fair trade, market forces. Nobody else gets that benefit. There is a huge amount of damage to our environment and to our people because of the activities of the fossil fuel industry. I would support a carbon tax, of course, but I would suggest that we already do have a kind of a carbon tax. And it is paid by the people who live in the shadows of the refineries, people whose lives are cut short by air and water pollution, and those who die and are maimed in wars for oil and other things. We're paying a very hefty tax for the continued use of fossil fuel, but it's not being paid by the right people. Globally, the unrecovered externalized costs of fossil fuels have been calculated by the International Monetary Fund to exceed $5 trillion per year. That is 6.5% of the world's GDP. Those are costs created by the fossil fuel industry, but paid by everybody else. That price, the price we pay for fossil fuel economy, needs to include 4.2 million deaths per year from air pollution, 11,000 people per day who die from fossil fuel pollution. There's absolutely nothing healthy about an economy that is based on fossil fuels. Now for the good news. This is a carrot and stick presentation. You get the stick first. Okay, now for the carrot. Earlier this year, we've got Ed Golly here, who's got a tremendous amount of solar on his house. The cost of solar continues to plummet. The amount of solar that is deployed continues to skyrocket. This is in spite of the fact that we are propping up the fossil fuel industry. We're displacing costs. You know, this is not the result of a fair and open marketplace. This is not capitalism in the classical sense where everybody's on a level playing field. In spite of everything that the Koch brothers and their pals can do, solar is still coming on strong. Earlier this year, India pledged to end coal imports in a few years. They've canceled the construction of 14 new coal-fired power plants. And India's economy is poised to become coal-free by 2050. After the year 2030, all new cars sold in India will be electric. Yeah. Last year, China.
May I have your attention, please? The library will be closing in 25 minutes. You have 25 minutes remaining to complete all transactions. If you need assistance finding an item, checking things out, or printing, please let one of our helpful staff members know. If you are working on one of our computers, please make sure you're printing your items out before 8 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Okay.
We have until 8:30.
Yeah, don't panic.
We're good.
So, last year, China doubled its photovoltaic capacity. China has made the decision to invest $361 billion in renewable power. They are going to create 13 million jobs in the next 13 years. 1 million jobs a year in China from renewable energy. Saudi Arabia, okay, they get their oil for about $9, $10 a barrel. Okay, they're investing $50 billion in renewable energy because it's cheaper for them to do that than it is for them to burn the oil that they already have. And in Dubai, solar power is now selling retail at 3 cents a kilowatt hour. It's about a quarter of what we pay for electricity. Worldwide, the switch to renewable energy is on. And in the case of China and India, there's two reasons. You know, they are losing thousands of people a year to air pollution. They have a real serious health problem in those countries, all right? But then the second reason is because both of them import coal. Both of them have large areas where they need to extend electrical infrastructure that doesn't have it now. They're not going to go from a centralized grid like we have to a distributed grid. They're just going to go straight to distributed renewable energy, whether it's solar or wind. They're skipping right over that. It's exactly what happened with telephones. Okay, you go to a third world country that there's no wires and poles and stuff. It's cell towers. They just went right over to cell, and that's what's happening with renewable energy in developing countries. And this is why we don't really have to be so concerned about the big carbon footprint of countries like China and India. Because, you know, Australia and America are the ones with the big carbon footprints per capita. We're the ones who don't seem to have gotten the message. For Florida, we need to understand something that every economist gets. When you are importing fuel, or anything else for that matter, but let's talk about energy, you know, when you're importing fuel, you're fundamentally exporting jobs, okay? You're sending jobs to Wyoming to mine coal, or you're sending jobs to Oklahoma to frack gas. We don't need to import fuel to Florida. It's not in our short-term or long-term economic interest. Florida generates more electricity than any state except Texas, but we generate less solar electricity than Massachusetts. What is up with that?
We're the Sunshine State.
And we're the Sunshine State. Yeah, we're one of only 4 states in the nation where you cannot take private capital and generate electricity and sell it back to the grid. So Florida farmers don't get to do what farmers in Georgia do. In Georgia, farmers are getting from $300 to $700 to I recently read as much as $1,200 per acre per year doing solar farming. This is money that comes in a check every month, regular, regular predictable income. Okay, Florida farmers do not get that. I grew up on a farm. We got paid 4 times a year in Kentucky. When we sold the tobacco, we've already talked about that. When we sold the pigs, when we sold the lambs, when we sold the calves. 4 checks a year. You never really knew how much any of those checks were going to be. You didn't really know when you were going to get them. If we'd have been able to get a regular check every month in a predictable amount, I would probably still be on that farm. Okay? The prohibition against third-party sales to grid is also the reason why people who own commercial buildings, people who are landlords, can't put solar panels on the roof and sell electricity to their tenants. It is anti-free enterprise. It's anti-capitalistic. It's pro-monopoly. If you happen to be an investor-owned utility, it's a great thing. Nationally, the average wage of solar installers is $26 an hour. That ain't bad. Most of these, 2/3 of those jobs do not require a college degree. The solar jobs are growing 12 times as fast as the economy generally, and solar now employs more Americans than gas and oil combined, and twice as many as are mining coal. Coal is dead. Okay, get over it, Trump. It's just not, it ain't coming back. I think I repeat myself to say that 2/3 of the solar jobs do not require a college degree. It bears mentioning that the workforce is ethnically and gender diverse. 28% female, 19% Latinos, 7% African American, 9% are veterans. Okay? I should have mentioned, I don't think I did. In Florida, the transition to renewable energy will create at least 300,000, probably about 320,000 jobs. Permanent jobs in Florida, 40-year jobs for people who really need work. It is going to be
Is that based on like the number of like energy, like how much energy is needed?
Yes.
Like if we transition completely? Okay.
Yes, yes. Actually, you know, energy demand in Florida has been flat, even though the population has been increasing because of improvements in energy efficiency. We still have a lot of room to move on that, but so far we haven't really needed. And let me, you know, I applaud the fact that TECO has put up a solar farm down there at Apollo Beach. It's a wonderful thing. We need to do a whole lot more of that. The reality is, as I understand it, solar energy is the most cost effective. It's the cheapest new energy that they can add. So it's great for environmental reasons, but it's also great for economic reasons. And that's the whole reason why I'm actually, you might not have guessed this, but you'll get it later on. I'm very optimistic, okay? We're going to beat this thing. And we're going to beat it because of the economics of it. All right? That's what's going to happen. Now, we've got some hurdles with, you know, we got to get the government in line. We got to take down barriers to solar development, and we got to get frank and real and serious about the threat that sea level rise is to our state in particular. Excuse me. And by the way, that the last time I checked, there were about 460,000 unemployed people in Florida. So if you give 320,000 of those people jobs, you have gotten rid of 2/3 of our unemployment without even considering they always, in economics, and I don't know why, but I mean, I do know why. They always say there's a multiplier effect, okay? If you give one person a job, you create 2 more, okay? So I don't even know where we're going to come up with all those people. But it is absolutely true that economically, the transition to renewable energy is going to be great for our state. The Sierra Club, of course, is proud to be partnering with Organize Now and other organizations in promoting a transition to renewable energy in Tampa in particular. America, Florida, Tampa, we are at a crossroads, a critical crossroads. Tampa needs to join St. Pete, Orlando, Sarasota, South Miami, Miami Beach, Daytona Beach, and other Florida cities in making a serious commitment to renewable energy. Tampa is particularly important. You know, I really feel like we're at ground zero for this because we have all these other cities on board. Tampa is the missing link. You bring Tampa into the mix and you swing the whole state. Okay? When you bring Florida on board, you can bring the rest of the country on board. And if we don't get the United States squared away and headed in the right direction pretty soon, we're headed for a very, very tough time. Tampa has an opportunity to really distinguish itself as a forward-thinking, innovative community that is moving into the 21st century with confidence and purpose. We can create in Tampa an environment that will be attractive and retentive. We will both bring in the best minds and we will keep the ones that are already here. But there is literally no time to waste. Solar power is a proven, profitable, mature technology that will delay and possibly possibly even avoid a climate disaster. The deliberate, rapid development of solar in Florida will literally bring an economic boom to our state. And I mean this sincerely. It will be the greatest thing for Florida since the invention of air conditioning. I swear. In the words of Van Jones, and
Excuse me, may I have your attention, please? The library will close in 15 minutes. Please begin finishing all transactions at this time. If you do not call for your ride, please do so immediately. Thank you.
later this week, on Friday, the Bridge down at and the Sierra Club and other sponsors are going to be showing a film called Catching the Sun at the Unity Tampa. That's on Horatio Street, 3302 West Horatio Street, 7 p.m. this Friday. Commissioner Kemp and recently retired EPC Director Rick Garrity, solar banker Bakari Kennedy, and solar homeowner Ed Golly will be there to discuss solar power. So to wrap up, I will quote the words of Van Jones, who is prominently featured in that film. And he did say, "We have an historic opportunity. We can employ the people who most need work, doing the work that most needs to be done. We can fight poverty and pollution at the same time." I absolutely agree with that. And I tell you with absolute confidence, yes, we are going to put America back to work again. Okay? Building a renewable energy grid, not building no damn wall. But we are going to put America back to work again, and we're going to save our grandchildren's planet in the process. Thank you.
So before we do question and answer, I'm going to do a quick thing. It's called a pulse check. How are people feeling? Just let me know, because there's probably someone in this audience that feels the same way as you, and it feels really nice to share that. I feel anxious.
Yeah.
I feel anxious and excited.
And excited. Good.
I'm freaked out.
Freaked out. You said to me earlier, you ever want to wring somebody's neck? Yeah, I feel that way too.
Frustrated.
Frustrated? Yeah. Definitely, me too.
Weirdly hopeful. Yeah. Presentation took a nice turn.
I'm feeling grateful that Ken's such an amazing presenter.
First thing, it was nice to hear the positive side that what we can do. Thank you, that was a great way to present it.
Yeah. I think we definitely need to remain optimistic. We're gonna say something?
I'm thankful that Kent's here and not on that farm.
We love you. But yeah, we do need to be optimistic or nothing will change. And I was, so I lived in Portland for a little while, and that's where I learned about like radical direct action. I was working with a group that went out, we drove 5 hours east to a Native American reservation where they were going to be driving a bunch of machinery to do tar sand mining, driving this giant thing called a megaload, which is a giant piece of machinery, up to Canada, and going to go right through this Native American reservation. And we went out there, and I didn't know this was going to happen. They did it all in secret. I was just there to support. And these activists chained themselves to the piece of machinery, and they delayed the megaload from moving for 2 weeks. And then there was a snowstorm, and it ended up delaying it over a month, which it still ended up going, but it cost that company so much money. But while I was out there, the Native Americans that lived on the reservation came out to support and to talk about what it meant to them to have this giant piece of machinery that's just going off to destroy the environment go right through their sacred reservation. And a Native American mother gave a speech, and I'll never forget what she said. She said, "When things go bad, my children are going to look at me and say, if you knew this was happening, why didn't you do anything? Where were you when the data was coming out? Why didn't you do anything?" How many people, and this might be kind of an awkward question, but how many people will be alive in 2060 in this room? 2060.
I hope.
I'll be 100 years old.
It's kind of an awkward question, but it's a hard question. It's a hard question.
Do you know something I don't know?
I don't know. I don't know what's going on, but I know that I'm gonna be alive personally, and so I'm trying to figure out how to, I'm going to the gym, I'm working out, I'm gonna have to fight people to for food. Yeah. So anyways, this is all just one big pulse check. 'Cause that's how I'm feeling. I'm feeling I gotta survive. But yeah, so yeah, that's it. And so now that we've had this change of energy, did you want to say something?
No, question.
Oh, yeah, now that we've had a change of energy, I'm going to throw it back to Kent for question and answer. Unless you had a question for me. Perfect. Perfect segue.
I'll do my best.